everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Industry Leader Spotlight, a video segment dedicated to showcasing influential personalities driving innovation and shaping the energy transition around the world. Each feature provides a window into their expertise and strategies as they share their valuable insights about industry trends and how to foster engagement towards tomorrow's decarbonizing technologies. My name is Cecilia Teruggi, Director of Decarbonization Policies at GE Vernova, and I am delighted to be your host today. For this first edition, we're following on from the webinar CCS Policies, a Practical Toolkit. During this enriching discussion, we described the theoretical and practical strategies to develop effective CCS policies and regulations. After our debate among European stakeholders, we wanted to broaden the conversation and give our audience the opportunity to explore CCS policies in other parts of the world. The United States of America and Canada lead globally in CCS product development, holding first and second place respectively. And we feel that telling the story of how they achieved this can be an excellent follow-up to the conversation. This is why we are delighted to cross the Atlantic to Canada and welcome Beth Valiaho to our Industry Leader Spotlight. Beth, you are Vice President of Public Affairs and International Engagement at the International CCS Knowledge Centre, a Canadian nonprofit whose mission is to advance CCS deployment worldwide. You dedicated your career to collaborate with global decision makers and accumulated extensive expertise in climate policy, regulations, and international financing around carbon capture and storage. Beth, thank you for joining us for this session. Our goal today will be to explore the challenges of policy design and the practical solutions adopted in North America and especially in Canada. And our aim is to provide valuable insights for a global audience in order to advance CCS deployment efforts in North America, but also around the world. North America is leading the pack when it comes to CCS, and our first question will be the following. When building the frameworks that enabled such success, what were the primary challenges observed, both from the public and private sector's perspective?
First of all, Cecilia, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here today. When we're trying to drive CCS policy, the cost of CCS has always been the number one issue that people always turn to. And trying to figure out how to incentivize CCS to make it make sense to be able to take hold is really where we start. And so incentivizing CCS and policies really are where we're at today. But there were projects that happened previously. The Boundary Dam Project, Quest, the projects in the United States like Petronova, and some of those started from a different point. They really took government grants in different one-off programs to get the first of a kind projects going. Right now, as we start to transition into a rebirth of CCS here, I would call it, what we're seeing is there's more incentivizing design structures that are being put in place. And so we're trying to access different measures such as tax policy, procurement policies, other things that are going to drive CCS to happen from a government angle still to incentivize that, but without giving full-on grant dollars to these projects. And so what we're seeing also in Canada and the United States are those tax measures. In the United States, the International CCS Knowledge Center was fortunate to be involved bipartisanly with the Senate staffers as they developed the 45Q tax incentive under the new IRA structure. And by doing that with a production tax credit, it ensures that all of the CO2, every CO2 molecule that's sequestered, either through permanent storage or enhanced oil recovery, is going to get a benefit back. Now, the same thing with Canada, we started worrying about the competitiveness, with the United States. And how would Canada match that in an incentivizing structure? What we're looking at in Canada now, and it actually just passed, it formally is an investment tax credit. And that's a bit different than a production tax credit. The investment tax credit is on the front end. So for a capture project, 50% of the capital cost is covered through the investment tax credit. It's a little higher for direct air capture at 60 and a little lower for transportation and storage, at 37.5, those are reflective of the costs that it takes to do those projects. So after 2030, those percentages half, but we're really trying to drive those projects by 2030 to accelerate their deployment.
This is very interesting because it also shows that you really need to cover all aspects of the CCS value chain to actually make it happen, and you need really this cooperation between public and private sector. So this is very good insight for our audience to take this into account. And building up from here, and maybe this was one of the crucial takeaways that we got from the CCS policy webinar, was the significance of contextualizing CCS policies and regulations to fit local conditions, ensuring a tailored framework that resonates effectively, right? And I know that in Canada, given the autonomy of provinces, CCS regulations are developed at the provincial level. So I just was wondering if this variety of regulations impacted the overall development of CCS policies and projects across Canada, or were there other context elements unique to Canada to consider during the initial phases of the policy design?
So in Canada, Canada's big. Canada is very big, and it has a bunch of provinces and territories. But our geology, especially in Western Canada, is beautiful. We've got almost 400 billion tons of sequestration opportunities in Western Canada alone. And with that, CCS regulations are designed in provinces to an extent, right? There's a division of powers, is how it works in Canada. And so anything from healthcare to education to defense, these types of things are divided either from the federal or the provincial government. When our Constitution was made, the environment wasn't as important as it is today. And so environmental concerns were not regulated underneath that or divided that way. So we often turn to, industry, which is, for the provinces, or resources, which, trying to figure out how to fit it into this division legally. But that being said, what we've done in Canada is the CCS storage in particular is where we turn to the safety, the legislation, those pieces. And so the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan have all gotten the okay by the federal government for under its investment tax credit that their storage provisions are adequate enough to enable the investment tax credit to be offered. When we turn to provinces like Manitoba, Ontario, even to the Atlantic provinces and Quebec, we're starting to see more attention given to try and figure out where those storage parameters lie. All of them have to have monitoring, measuring, reporting, and verification that are all going to ensure that that CO2 is safely stored. But in terms of long-term liability, how offset credits work, whether that's for sequestration, enhanced oil recovery, these types of things, that is all in the provincial domain at this time, trying to determine where, and how it can be safely regulated. This also ensures locally that there's, a local understanding of your geology and your concerns about who owns the mineral rights, etc. In Alberta, for instance, the underground storage the pore space has been taken over by the Crown. So the government offers tenure to different people that apply to store CO2 in that area in a hub type model. And so 25 hubs have put in for applications. There's about 6 right now that are in their final stages. But understanding that long-term liability and the government ownership of the pore space in Alberta has been a major benefit for getting these projects to have some assurances that, there's public understanding of safety.
Absolutely. And if I may ask, is the carbon price also a provincial matter, or is it a federal matter?
It's a great question, and it is confusing. It's very similar to this division of powers type of a piece. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the federal government is able to set a price on carbon because emissions are of a national concern. And so that price on carbon has a benchmark that they set. Each of the provinces and territories can either determine to take on the federal structure and just do what the federal government wants, or provinces like Alberta, for instance, have their own program. So the Alberta Technology Innovation Program that they have set up, the Tier Fund, actually takes a certain amount of money from the heavy emitters and puts it into a fund and then disperses that back to innovative projects. From that benchmarked price that the federal government has, currently the Alberta government matches that same amount. There are two types of pricing for carbon in Canada. There's a fuel and food type of a charge, and then there's also an industrial emission type charge. And that industrial type emission type charge is really what we see that's driving this technological innovation and creating certainty for industry as they're starting to price their carbon. So with that, I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more some of the topics you touched on with contracts for differences and other things. But before I do, I would also say that in terms of regulatory structure, like you mentioned, everywhere can be different. Everywhere can be tailored to what is suited. And we see that even across Canada as we go to all the different provinces. Ontario wishes to take a different approach, its own made in Ontario approach, than maybe the Western Canadian provinces do. They have different considerations like, maybe international borders with Michigan or under Lake Erie. The eastern provinces looking into the Atlantic, maybe they can learn a lot more from places like Norway and Denmark than Western Canada. So there's lots of considerations across Canada. And if we move down into the United States, that's a whole other, what we would say, kettle of fish in the Atlantic provinces of Newfoundland, where I'm from. And, we're really seeing the same type of what do we do about permitting? What do we do about overall across the country approaches, especially when it comes to administrative pieces? And that's where we're starting to see some of the pinch points starting to evolve.
I couldn't agree more with what you say, and the way you presented it showed perhaps that even if it can look complicated from an outside perspective, it really works in the field because, as we mentioned at the beginning, both Canada and the USA are leading CCS product development. So I think that's an interesting take, that we shouldn't be scared about complex political contexts because all political contexts can enable CCS policies and regulations. Also, another topic that we saw in recent discussions on CCS policies was the fact that crafting effective policies requires keeping the lines of communications open between the private and public sector, and because it's essential to make sure that policies align with the needs of the stakeholders on the field, right? So, Beth, maybe from your experience, which approaches have proven effective in North America to ensure a productive public-private dialogue? And has it yielded positive results, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question. In Canada, I mentioned this division of power type of a situation. One of the things that we see is that it's a carrot and a stick approach that the federal government takes. So a lot different than the United States that, really incentivizes strong to get CCS deployed. In Canada, while we do have the incentive structures in place, there's also a regulatory piece that drives a lot of this. And that's where the industry interaction with the federal government often becomes, more heated or a lot more interactive. And so things like the clean electricity regulations in Canada, where the federal government can regulate electricity emissions or, proposed oil and gas caps, these types of things is where tension goes. It's trying to drive innovative approaches from another way, as opposed to incentivizing, it's trying to limit the emissions. And so that, coupled with a carbon pricing approach, really has been the federal approach to drive those emission reductions. In doing so, I think it, again, is Canada having a vast landscape. And so having many different types of electricity needs, for instance, across the country is very important. The coal emissions phase out that happened across Canada was really important. Of course, the Boundary Dam carbon capture and storage facility is on a coal plant, and that's reducing the emissions off the coal plant. But then a lot of the projects we see for electricity in the West focus on like looking to natural gas. And where you're trying to balance that with figuring out if you're going to have small modular reactors, and then you try to have a one size fits all policy across Canada where Manitoba or Quebec or Ontario all have hydroelectricity and different nuclear options. It's really hard to make everyone happy. And so when you ask about private and public interchange and dialogue, that's where we see a lot of the pinch points. And so CCS often gets put as the backup option to reduce those emissions. And that can also be a tricky spot for CCS because you don't want to just be the, well, we have to do it approach when it's very costly at times and we're trying to balance the best options for companies. So in doing that, that's one of the lenses from the Knowledge Center that we look at, trying to figure out, what is the best policy approach and how to integrate and advocate for industry as well as educate the governments in understanding those dynamics.
Absolutely. And one of the key takeaways of the webinar we did was that there is no one size fits all endeavor or framework for a CCS policy, that what's important is really to stick to the facts and the reality of the given region or country. So thank you for that. And with these essential preliminary considerations out of the way, let's move on to more practical solutions, the tools and approaches that actually enable to deliver on CCS ambitions. We've pinpointed the creation of viable business models for CCS as a significant barrier to deployment across global region, and an undeniable challenge that demands attention. Moving forward, our first question revolves around this critical issue. So in Europe, and we've seen that in the webinar, countries like Denmark have championed carbon contracts for difference schemes to enhance the economic viability of CCUS. Yet over in the US and Canada, it seems that tax incentives are prioritized when it comes to support mechanisms. Beth, why do you think this divergence exists, and how do you see this approach working out so far for CCS stakeholders in North America?
So carbon contracts for difference is something that we're looking at trying to enable in Canada. We call it a carbon contract for difference based on the carbon price. So of course, countries like the UK have had exceptional, benefit of using a contract for difference for its electricity demand. We've seen it for offshore wind in Denmark. People have these structures that have been in place for quite some time. There has been some of that in Canada when it comes to renewables, et cetera, but it hasn't been a widely adopted type of a framework. And so I think right now the Canadian government is struggling to figure out that balance. Now, what they have said is that by 2030, they intend for the carbon price to rise by, a significant amount every year to get to $170 Canadian a ton. At that point, we think that CCS will be much more viable and more economic to do. But it isn't a legislated target. It is an ambition that the federal government has put forward. So a lot of the companies say, well, how do we have the certainty that that will be the carbon price that will ensure our operating costs of this project moving forward? The Canadian Growth Fund was put forward to make contracts for difference for a variety of things. What we've seen to date, though, is that it has not put a standard strike price in place and a standardized contract type process to enable these projects to move forward. What it has done is it's made 2 CCS contracts so far, but they were for off-take agreements with investment into the companies as well. And so in doing so, it was at a lower price of $86.50, and another one around the same price for these projects, but also investing into the company. What they do with that price is they're buying the offtake of the project, and they're banking that against that tier fund in Alberta, where they have the offset credits at a price that may escalate based on that, having to match that benchmark price that I mentioned earlier. So right now, excuse me. So right now, if the federal government buys, commits to buying at a lower price and that price rises, maybe they can sell at a higher price. It makes sense right now for these smaller, though, projects. So some of these larger projects that we're trying to get going, we're really concerned about. We've seen some projects that we were really hopeful for, like a combined cycle natural gas project, for instance, not reach final investment decision because they didn't have the certainty for those price measures for long-term operating costs. So really, we're hoping that we start to move the dial on getting those carbon contracts for differences in place with a common strike price for others to join on board.
Hopefully that happens. Well, we'll have a close eye on that. Moving now on a concrete application of carbon capture. We've seen that CCS is part of a broader effort by the Canadian government to deploy decarbonization technologies in heavy industry, but also in the power sector. And this is quite unique compared to global practices. Maybe our audience doesn't know this, but usually policies and regulations about CCS are really about hard-to-abate industries and more than the power sector. What regulatory path have been chosen to support this choice? And can you walk us through the rationale behind this decision?
So in Canada, the way that it's approached is really agnostic to where the emissions are coming from. And to be honest, I really like that. It is technology neutral, and it's also industry neutral that way. It allows any industry to reduce its emissions, based on these carrots and sticks that we talked about, using whatever technology means that they wish. And so that makes it available to have any tool in the toolbox. This is about emissions that we're trying to reduce, not reducing industry, not reducing jobs. And so by enabling CCS across the board, you're making sure that there are many different options. Like I mentioned, Canada's a vast country. There's a lot of natural gas, for instance, in Western Canada, that's at a very cheap price. But there's not as much renewable opportunities in terms of hydro, for instance, that you see in Manitoba or Ontario. And that makes it a tricky situation, especially as we started to phase out the coal plants in Canada and started to bring on new natural gas plants. Well, now we're in a situation where we have a lot of new natural gas plants. If we can reduce those emissions by doing carbon capture and storage with an abundant amount of sequestration opportunities, it just makes sense. And so, that being said, I'm a big proponent of trying to get CCS for hard to abate sectors as well. We have worked directly with iron and steel companies, with cement companies, to try and enable them to accelerate their deployment on these projects. So right now we're seeing a great strides in Canada where we might have a great cement plant in Alberta capturing in the next couple of years. We're looking to out east, in Ontario, Quebec, these areas, maybe iron and steel will start to happen soon. And so from those projects, what's really important is that a lot of those hard to abate sectors have international companies that are involved as opposed to local. When you have the power companies, there's a lot of localized power understanding. But in terms of hard to abate, if we can take companies like Wholesome and Heidelberg or ArcelorMittal and these global companies, and they can use the incentivized policies in North America to get those one or two first facilities, then they can take the lessons learned from those facilities to their fleet globally, and not just in Europe, but in places in developing countries, maybe China, maybe India, places that really need to accelerate their emission reductions. We all do, but we can also start to have a global impact.
Definitely. And GE Vernova is also convinced that a technology neutral approach is really the way to go when it comes to CCS. And maybe on another note, I would like to ask you about an interesting statement you made regarding your participation at COP28 in Dubai last December 2023. You mentioned that Canada's experience in CCS development can benefit other countries looking to invest in this sector. How can we draw lessons from Canada's CCS pathway, and how can this story actually help other countries around the world?
It really leans into my last comments in your question previous. I really do feel that by actually deploying these technologies, instead of just saying we're going to deploy the technologies in CCS, makes a big difference. The Boundary Dam project in October will be 10 years of operation. It is still currently the only large-scale integrated CCS facility on power in the world. That's not good enough. And of course, Petronova in the United States is also on a coal plant, but it's not fully integrated in the same fashion. 2, though, not enough. And so we need to make sure that there's a responsibility as we invest in these projects that we're bringing them to developing countries as well. And so whether that means capacity building, understanding, there's even, CCS 101 that is part of this. We're starting to see the Green Climate Fund, for instance, provide dollars for technology readiness. This is really important. Trinidad and Tobago received the first payment from the Green Climate Fund. We unlocked it, right? That's great. We need to start doing more of that. And so while a lot of these companies and projects that are going around in the world are looking at their own project, because these projects are hard, so you're really focused. But if I can give the benefit of a decade of having the Boundary Dam project having operated, there's so many lessons learned. There are mistakes. There are different decisions and different pivots that had to be made. There are optimizations. All of these things are lessons learned that everyone needs to know. You might have the greatest engineering team ever, but some little piece of insight from somebody else's project could make a vital decision in whether your project even moves forward or, while it's operating, if it operates successfully. So more dialogue, more understanding, more lessons learned and knowledge sharing at a crucial level, not just a, hey, here's my project, it's great, that's good too. But real in-depth understanding is what we really try and facilitate with the Knowledge Center.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Also, once again, during the webinar, we really tried to explain to people that we have a lot of existing solutions out there already existing, and you just need to go and get them and see what's there, what could fit your specific context. Canada is definitely a great example to watch for our audience if you're interested in knowing the way they handled and managed the CCS policy framework there. Maybe to wrap up our discussion and looking ahead, what are the key priorities or actions you believe stakeholders should focus on to advance the implementation of CCS policies effectively, both in Canada and around the world?
I think a level of understanding for government becomes very important. I do believe that the most successful accelerated projects come from a corporate CEO down approach. And from that, those discussions at a government level have more weight. When a CEO asks the technical person in the organization, hey, can we do CCS? Often the answer comes back and says, here are the costs and here are the barriers. And so it becomes a real friction point with the board, et cetera, to try and figure out how to make that happen. In order to drive policy and make these projects more effective, and a deeper understanding at the decision maker level needs to have an interaction with government. Honestly, that becomes one of the key ways to do it. Governments talking to one another, people facilitating dialogues to make those things happen, lessons learned from others, all of these things are really important, but your case will always be unique to you, and you always have to be considerate of that.
Thank you for joining our first Industry Leader Spotlight feature. We hope that this deep dive into North America's CCS pathway has proven insightful and useful. We at GE Vernova are truly committed to make sure that all available technologies can play a role in advancing the world's decarbonization, and CCS is undoubtedly one of them. For other resources on CCS policy, please visit our website, vernova.is/CCS policy, to see more of our content. We'd also like to extend our sincere gratitude to Beth Valiaho for participating in this session. And to our audience, we encourage you to take your learnings from this session back to your organizations and communities. Take action to advocate for stronger CCS policies. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Industry Leader Spotlight feature.